One of the most challenging aspects of being a freelancer in the music industry is setting your actual project rates. Whether you're a producer or a mixing engineer, mastering engineer, songwriter, it can be really overwhelming to set a project rate because there are so many different factors that go into it. You've got so many different situations and circumstances. You're always comparing yourself to whatever the market is offering. So in this video today, I want to talk about my process of setting rates. I want to talk about some things that you may want to keep in mind when you're setting your project rates. And I want to talk about some things that people don't really consider that I think a lot of the time people undercharge because they're not considering these extra factors. So we're going to go over all of that in this video today. By the end of the video, hopefully you feel comfortable setting a rate for whatever services you're offering. But before we do that, my name's Austin. You're watching Make Pop Music. We have weekly tutorials on music and music production. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. That helps out our channel a bunch. We do videos like this every single Friday. And then after the video, if you want to support our channel, you can head over to our website, makepopmusic.com. We have sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, courses, a free ebook on being a freelancer, all kinds of really, really cool stuff over there. So go check that out. Now let's talk about actually setting your project rates. Before I go over things to consider, I just will give you a short little background on me. I am a freelance producer. I've been a freelancer now for about 8 years. And over those 8 years, I've worked on thousands of projects. I've done work for hire work. I've done label work. I've done work for Backend. I've done pretty much every situation and circumstance that we're going to go over in this video. So I am speaking from experience. I have been making a living off of music now for about 8 years. So just keep that in mind. I know a lot of the time people see things on YouTube and they don't really know who's delivering that information, but I promise you, I have been doing this for a minute, and everything that I'm going to tell you today are things that I have actually implemented myself and things that I've seen my friends and my peers who are also professionals implement. So let's go ahead and let's just dive in. I want to start with things that you may want to consider when you're setting your rates, whether that's for production, mixing, mastering, songwriting, any kind of service that you could offer in the music industry. And the first thing that I want to talk about is getting paid for your time. So that's obviously the bare minimum. Getting paid for your time just means that, you know, if you're producing a song, it takes physical time doing that. If you're engineering a project, you have to physically do that. If you're songwriting, it takes that time to do it. You should at least get paid for your time, not in the sense of, you know, everything has to be charged hourly, but as you're setting your project rate, you should know about how long it's going to take you to do that production or that mix. So make sure that you're being compensated fairly for that. Now, that's only one small piece of the puzzle. That's the biggest thing that I see people consider when they're setting their rates. They think, oh, it'll take me 5 hours to mix a song. Let's say I charge $50 an hour. That's a pretty good hourly rate. That's $250. So they may charge $250 for a mix, but that's not the only thing that goes into that mix. Let's talk about the next things to consider. So number 2 is going to be getting paid for your access to different gear or resources. So when people pick a producer, a lot of the time they pick a producer that has a certain sound, and a lot of the time they pick a producer or a mixing engineer. It's because of the gear and the resources that they have and that they regularly use. So say you're in Nashville and you own a studio or you run a studio and you have a room where you can do live drums, you have live pianos, you have a bunch of vintage guitars. You're probably going to be able to charge a little bit more than somebody like me who's in a bedroom who doesn't have access to that stuff, because in Nashville, that's a big part of their music scene. Most people are going to want to live track drums. Most people will want to go play a Rhodes. So if you have those things, you can charge a little bit more. Where me, I mostly produce remotely, so I need to have access to a bunch of different plugins, a bunch of different programs where I can do a ton of different genres. So every time, you know, somebody needs a bass that sounds like Dua Lipa, I have that on my file. Or every time somebody needs a horn that sounds like Silk Sonic, I have access to that, and I don't have to go keep buying things for projects, or I don't have to tell them, hey, you know, like I don't really have the resources or the gear or anything to kind of like achieve the sound that you want. So make sure that you kind of keep that in mind. The bigger studio you have, the more gear you have, the more resources and session musicians you have, you can charge a little bit more for that. And if not, you're going to have to keep adding that onto projects later. The third factor is make sure that you're considering being paid for your creative ideas. So whether you're songwriting or mixing or producing, you're putting your creativity into every project no matter what. There's going to be some creative choices. They're the reason that you should be getting hired, right? People want your brain, they want your sound, and they want your taste on their song. That all comes across through your creativity. So if you're a mixing engineer and you're saying, yeah, it takes me 5 hours, I'm going to charge for 5 hours of mixing work, make sure that you're also factoring in, I'm going to also do these delay throws that I know how to do creatively. I'm going to also, you know, do some filtering to where the track can open up. You can add your stamp and add your taste and add your sound. And those things need to be considered when you're setting a rate, because that's what sets different people in the industry apart from another. So make sure that you consider your creative ideas, especially if you're producing or songwriting, because once you deliver, you know, a chord progression or a synth lead or a vocal melody, that's gone forever. So this will kind of come into play a little bit later when we talk about getting paid upfront as work for hire or taking royalties and backend, because a lot of the time people will take the royalties to kind of compensate for those ideas just in case the song blows up. But if you're doing work for hire, make sure you consider that those creative ideas are finite, and once they get used, they are used. The fourth thing to consider is make sure you're getting paid for your expertise. This is that kind of classic situation of people saying, it didn't take me 2 hours to mix a song, it took me 10 years to learn how to mix, and then 2 hours to do your mix. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. That's a super simplified statement, but it's basically saying, I don't charge hourly when I produce a song because I don't want to be punished for being able to produce that song quickly, because I have the knowledge and the wherewithal, and I've done it before. When I started producing, it might take me 2 or 3 days to produce the first draft of a song. And now it might take me 4 hours. And now what I can do in 4 hours is infinitely better than what I could do in 2 days. So I'm not going to punish myself by charging hourly, because all of those years have to kind of be compensated for. That's why people hire professionals. That's why people hire, seasoned vets. And that's why, especially as a newcomer, it can be hard to get people to trust you with their projects, is because you don't have all of that expertise and all of that trial and error already built up. So their project may take a little bit longer. Their project may, be a little bit more demanding for you, but you're not to the point where you can charge a little bit more because you haven't built that up. The fifth thing to consider, and this is something that I don't see hardly anybody actually consider, is it takes a lot of extra time to handle a project, between having project calls, emails, communicating with the artists, downloading their files, bouncing out their files and sending it to them, doing all of the deliverables. There's a lot of admin work that goes into a project. And if you don't have an assistant to do all of your project prep, and if you don't have a bookkeeper to handle your booking, it can take extra hours per project. So if I do a production and that production takes me 8 to 10 hours inside of the DAW, I probably spend another 2 to 3 communicating with that client, going back and forth about revisions, going back and forth about file delivery. Those are things that, that's also your time. It's not just the amount of time that you spend in Pro Tools or Cubase or Logic. It's also the amount of time that it takes to prep that project to get done. The next thing to consider is, how high is your demand? We all know about supply and demand. Essentially, the more in demand something is, the more that it can be charged for. So if you have a super rare pair of sneakers where there were only 1,000 made, they're going to be thousands and thousands of dollars, and they might be made out of the same materials as an Air Force One, but since there's 8 million pairs of an Air Force One, those are only $110. So if there's 1 million people trying to work with you, you're going to have to raise those rates so you can cut down on your booking, because you won't be able to take everybody. If you're having trouble staying booked, you have more supply than there is demand. So you might want to lower your rates just a little bit. We'll talk about that when we actually get to example rates, but keep in mind that if, you're getting busier and you're having trouble, narrowing down projects for your books, raise your rates a little bit, because people might be willing to pay that. And, you can spend the same amount of time on projects and make 20%, 30%, or even 40% more income just by raising those rates. And it'll kind of help to weed out the artists that can be a little bit of a headache to work with. The last thing that I like to consider when I'm setting my project rate is, what kind of extra value do I specifically add to that project? So like for me, I don't cap revisions. I'll do unlimited revisions until I feel like they're starting to hinder the song. And then I just have a, conversation with that artist and try to realign with the value or what the vision of the song is. Other than that, I don't cap revisions. I'm not one of those, you get 3 revisions and then I'm going to charge you $50. I also don't charge to deliver final stems and deliverables. So at the end of every project, I send a master, a pre-master, an instrumental, a version with no lead vocal, a version where the vocals are lower, but everything's kind of still in there. I'll send the acapella, and then I'll also send all of the stems and all of the multi-tracks. So every artist will have that in case they do live shows or they need it to, submit it to a sync licensing company. These are things that, as you start working with bigger artists, they're going to eventually come back and need that stuff anyway. So you might as well just deliver it, kind of lump that into your quote. Artists really, really appreciate it. Every single artist that I've worked with over the past 6 years since I started including this has loved it. So, add those extra things of value and then just kind of tuck that into your rate, where people know if they charge me XYZ amount of money, it's that much money, and then they're not going to come back and need $50 for this, $100 for this, $150 for this. People don't like being nickel and dime. So if you can have an all-inclusive rate, I highly suggest it. Now that we've talked about different things to consider in your project rate, let's talk about ways to actually get paid. So number one is going to be called work for hire. Typically, work for hire is just getting paid in cash for the project, and you don't take any publishing or any master split, no royalty whatsoever. It's just the fee for the project. So a lot of the time, mixing engineers, mastering engineers, and producers who are doing mostly independent projects will do work for hire. Now, the bad thing is that if a song blows up and becomes, the next Deja Vu by Olivia Rodrigo, you don't get any of that back end because you took however much money you charged them at the start. The good thing is, though, is that you're guaranteed money, because setting up things like all of your publishing, getting a master split, having to register it with all the different agencies. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. And on independent projects and smaller projects, the return is pretty negligible. So unless I think that a project is legitimately going to get tens of millions of streams, or it's going to get placed on a Netflix movie, or it's going to, pop off on TikTok, or the person that I'm working with has a massive following, I don't really care about Backend that much for independent projects, because it is honestly almost always more of a headache to set all of that up for me and for the artist than it is worth it to get, $150 over the next couple of years. I'd rather just have a rate that includes everything, turn the song over to them and just say, hey, whatever you want to do with it is what you want to do with it. So that's doing work for hire. The next thing is having a fee and taking some backend. So this would be an example of, if somebody hits me up to produce their song and I think that I have the potential to take some backend, I might say, yeah, I'm going to, instead of doing for $3,000 for the song, I'll do $2,500, and then I'll take points on the master. We'll talk about what that is in just a second, but it's essentially saying I'm going to guarantee money, and then I'm also going to take some back end, but I'm not expecting much. So if you're a songwriter, you can take that on publishing. If you're a producer, you can take that on points. It just all depends. The next thing is similar to that, but it's a little bit different. It's taken an advance plus that back end. So you still take the upfront fee, and you still are going to get your royalties later. However, you don't get those royalties until that artist or that label has actually recouped that whole thing. So let's say I did the $2,500 fee, but it was an advance, and then I did the back end. I'm not going to collect any royalties until that artist has at least made that $2,500 back that they gave me up front. This could be really worth it if you're working with like a massive artist, like if you're doing a Drake beat and, he offers you an advance of $150,000, like I would probably take that. They're not just going to give you that as a fee because that's an insane amount of money. They're going to want to make that back, but they'll probably end up making that back. And so when you take that advance, it's a lot of money up front. And then you can also just, maybe over the next couple years, start to kind of dip into that royalty, start to kind of dip into that publishing if you have that, or the, points on the master if you have that. That's taking in advance. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is doing spec work / pitching. And this basically means that nothing is guaranteed. You're not guaranteed to land a project. You're not guaranteed to get paid anything. You kind of just do it because you have the hopes of getting hired. So, let's say that I had a DM from The Weeknd, right? And he was like, oh, I have this new song. I would love to see what you can do with the production. But he's not guaranteeing that he's going to cut it, or he's not guaranteeing that my production's going to make it. I would just do that with the hopes of that landing. If it lands, then later we'll talk about the actual fee. Am I taking in advance? Am I taking back end? But with spec work, you do the work up front, not knowing if the song is ever even going to come out. So a lot of the time, there will be a mix of these things. Like if you do spec work and a song lands, then you're going to negotiate your fee in your back end or your advance in your back end. If you take spec work or you pitch a song and nothing lands, you don't really get anything, but it's going to be mostly no's as a career in the music industry anyway, so don't take it personally. Move on to the next project. All right, so we've talked a little bit about back end or royalties. Let's go ahead and talk about, is it actually worth it? I kind of talked a little bit earlier about how I'll only do it for bigger projects that I think might actually bring something in the long run. And that's because registering backend as a producer and for independent artists is kind of a pain in the ass. Like it's not a lot of fun to do. And unless a song does numbers, it's going to be so negligible for you. It's probably a waste of time. Like if I'm doing 8 productions a month, it would take me an entire day or two just to register all of those productions. And they're not going to make me much money over the next few years. I'd rather just charge them a rate, and that's what it is. So when you're working for backend, and there's a couple different avenues that you have. So you can take points on the master. This is typically reserved for the producers. Sometimes a mixing engineer will get 1 point. And essentially what that is on a record, the artists have a certain number of points. That's going to be their percentage of the sale that they get. And then they can kind of distribute that to other people. So, if I'm working with an artist and let's say they have 18 points and they give me 4 of them, I get 4 divided by 18 of whatever that artist is going to make. So it's just kind of my way of taking a payout on that master. It's a little bit convoluted. There's not an exact science. It's all negotiable. But if you're doing that, you need to have some kind of publishing agency to actually collect that, because unless, that artist or that label or their manager or somebody is sending you that every quarter, you have to have somebody that's going to basically hit them up and get you paid out every quarter. So it can be a pain in the ass if you don't have all of that in place. The next thing is a little bit more common. It's just publishing. This is typically reserved for songwriters, but sometimes artists will give it to producers, but it's mostly for songwriters. And there's 3 different categories for publishing. There are mechanical royalties, so that's going to come from like physical sales, like if they sell a vinyl or a CD. And then it also comes from like streaming revenue. And I think on average, it's like 6 cents per 100 streams or something like that. So it's not much money at all. And you have to have, again, an agency to collect that. So a lot of people use Songtrust, CD Baby, and TuneCore both have publishing offers that you can kind of register a song and you can collect those mechanical royalties. Then there's also sync royalties. Sync royalties are where you place a song in a movie or an advertisement or some kind of media usage. And typically those are, for bigger projects, they'll do like a sync fee. So like if I had a song used in a Netflix documentary, they would probably just give me a fee and just be able to use that perpetually. So sync royalties can be a little bit more rare. However, if you do land a song in a movie or an ad, they can pay out pretty well. So it might be worth negotiating something for that just in case it gets picked up. So you have your ass covered just in case the song does, land in the next big movie. And then the last little bit of royalties is performance royalties. This is probably the one that most people are common with. This is where you register it with your performance rights organization, so ASCAP, BMI, CSAC. And that means that you get paid every time that a song either plays on the radio or gets paid in like a public space. So if I have a song on like a Starbucks playlist, every time Starbucks plays that, I'm going to get some performance royalties from that. Or every time a radio station in Indonesia plays it, I'm going to get paid. And so your PRO is basically going to be the company that keeps track of how many times something gets paid out. Sometimes they'll also handle things like if you get a song on a TV show and it's not like a big sync payout, it's just going to be like a syndicate payout. Your performance royalty can also do that. Just make sure that if you're, negotiating for Backend, you actually understand all of this. This is a pretty run and gun explanation of publishing and of points. So if you want to see something a little bit more in depth, we can do a whole video on that, but I don't want to take up too much time with that. And then royalties is basically just like a generic term for Backend. So points can be royalties, publishing can be royalties. It basically just means money that you're making after the song is released. Nothing's guaranteed, but you might get something. Let's talk about how people actually set up their payment methods for projects. So if you're doing like a work for hire or a fee project, you can either get paid all up front. This kind of guarantees that the artist doesn't flake out, or even if they do, you've kind of made your money. It's not that big of a deal. A lot of people will do a 50% deposit and 50% on completion. So typically for me, when I'm working with an artist, I'll do 50% up front. And then as I finish the project, I'll get that last 50% before I send them all of their deliverables. And then the other thing is you could set up some kind of payment plan. There are different, programs or different websites or apps that you can actually schedule payment plans with clients and with artists. I never do this just because I've never wanted to actually go through and set it all up. But I know a lot of people that do, and it kind of helps them stay booked because people might not be able to afford $1,500 now and $1,500 in 3 weeks, but they could set up a payment plan over the next, 2 or 3 months, and then they can handle that. So now that we've talked about all of that, let's give some example rates. This will probably be one of the more helpful parts of this video. So let's talk about recording and engineering. This is if I'm, tracking somebody's vocals or tracking somebody to play live drums. Typically, it can be $50 to $150 an hour at smaller local studios. If you're a bigger studio or if you have, a gear selection or something like that, it's going to be anywhere between $150 and $500 an hour. And if you're going to a really, really big studio, like if you're going to like a Blackbird or an East West, it could be thousands of dollars per hour. But typically, if you just need to record your vocals and you find a small local studio that has a good vocal chain, you can probably go do that for about $150, $200 an hour. The next task is editing. So this would be like if somebody sends a bunch of vocals and I have to tune them and time align them, or if I need to comp together the vocals or, edit guitar DIs. This is typically between $75 and $150 an hour. And these are both things that I think you should charge hourly for. So recording and editing, I think 100% charge hourly. You don't have to really factor in your creativity as much. You don't really have to factor in giving up some of those creative ideas or kind of creative licenses. It's really just for your time and for your expertise being there and the gear that you have to kind of facilitate that. The next task would be mixing. I think for entry level, $200 to $400 is probably where most people sit at very beginner level. Under $200, I think is if you're charging under $200, I don't even think it's worth the time uploading all of the stems into your project and mixing the project and bouncing it and sending it back. Like just doing that alone will take an hour or two to actually set the project up, communicate with the artist, get everything handled. So I think at least charge $200 to $400. I think for solid indie work to get a mix that's, mostly hit, sometimes you'll hit a miss, are between $500 and $750. For $750 to $1,200, I think you're going to get a pretty consistent level, like independent mixer work. It's not going to be somebody who's mixing Drake or Beyonce or Rihanna or anybody like that, but you are going to get somebody who's going to deliver you a good mix that is deliverable. It's going to sound good. It can fit you into playlists. You're not basically going to get a bunch of comments where people are like, this mix is ass. So I would say if you're doing small label work, you could probably go between $1,200 and $2,500 for a mix. So if you're working with, up and coming label artists or, projects that the label doesn't really have a massive budget for, you could probably sit right about there. And when you get to the pro level label stuff, that can be anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 per song. If you're Manny American, you can probably charge whatever you want. If you're, Serbanganese, you can probably charge whatever you want. So I would say most people for independent mixing are going to be kind of sub $1,500. And within that, kind of figure out where you fit. Now, let's talk about producing a little bit. So producing for beginners, I would say that if you're going to charge anything, at least $400 to $600 for like the bare minimum, just because it takes time to, handle a project. If you're going to be mixing the project, if you have to track that artist, you're going to be giving them creative ideas, you're going to be facilitating it, and they're going to get a whole song at the end of that. So bare minimum, I think $400 to $600, even if you're just starting to charge for it. $600 to $1,200 for probably solid indie work. So these are going to be people that can turn in a good song most of the time. These are going to be people that can't always work with like the most consistent artists. However, you can kind of keep your books full and you can always deliver something where the artist feels pretty good about it. $1,200 to $1,800 is going to be for higher level indie work. That's going to be for people who are almost always consistent. They're starting to kind of dabble in smaller label projects. They're kind of, they've got the wherewithal to really deliver that project based on what the artist wants. They're not going to really run into a bunch of hiccups. Once you get to the area where it's like $2,000 to $4,000, that's going to be people who are professional. They're very consistent. They can always turn in something kind of radio ready. And they're working with smaller labels pretty frequently. They're working with larger independent artists pretty frequently. And, I think that for $2,000 to $4,000, you can get a really, really, really good production. Once you go over that, I think you're starting to get into that major label budget where once you get over, $5,000, that's where you're starting to probably want to negotiate Backend. That's where you're probably going to want to start having, somebody look over your contract for you. And then if, you're producing for the next big pop star, like if I'm producing for Olivia Rodrigo, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars per song. So that's like a whole different beast. I don't think many people watching this channel or this far into this video will be doing that. So there are some production rates. Let's talk a little bit about my rates just so you have a comparative point. And just so I can be completely transparent with you, and then that will do it for this video. So for production, if I'm doing independent projects, it's typically $3,000 to $4,000, and I'm typically doing those as work for hire. And there's just a range because some projects are smaller and easier. Some projects we may have to hire a session drummer, so we have to lump that in. Some projects may be really, really, really big tasks that are going to have massive productions that take me multiple days. Sometimes I have the artist flying here to track in person. Sometimes I have to go out and see somebody, or we have to hire co-writers. That all kind of factors in. I do a project quote for every project. I never, ever, ever have a set rate. I always kind of assess the project after a phone call and see what that artist wants to do, and then I can get them a quote that very specifically reflects their project. That's also something I highly recommend. If I'm working with, a label or I'm negotiating Backend or something, probably $4,000 to $6,000 is going to be the one project fee. Or advance, and then we'll talk about the back end. And typically my production rates will include the full production, co-writing, mixing, mastering. Again, I do unlimited revisions. I deliver all of their files, but unless we've kind of talked about it beforehand, like if we're doing like a $4,000 project, my base rate will not include costs for session musicians, hiring out tasks, if we need to hire additional editors, unless I know all of that when I make that first project quote. So if, we make a project quote and we agree on the terms and stipulations, and then later we need to hire a drummer or we need to hire a live piano player, that is not my responsibility to pay for it, and I make that known in my first initial contract. Here's everything that you do get when you pay for me. Here's everything that you will not get when you pay for me. So make sure that you kind of set that line really, really straight. For mixing, I'm basically just always work for hire, and it's about $1,000 to $1,500. This is not going to include any editing, pitch correction, vocal comping, or additional production. If they need all of that, again, I have to know that beforehand, and I can include that in addition to kind of my base rate for whatever their song would cost to mix. For songwriting, typically if I am doing songwriting, I'm only doing it with people that I want to be writing with. I don't do a lot of songwriting for Spec. It's mostly just people that I like working with. And if I'm doing that, I'll just take a publishing split. But if somebody specifically seeks me out and they say, hey, I want to pay you to write a chorus for me, I'm going to charge them for that because they specifically sought me out for a service. If I go to a songwriting camp in Nashville and it's just me and a couple buddies together and we're writing some songs, I'm obviously not going to charge them a day rate. I'm just going to hope that we place one of those songs and then I can take my publishing and my split on that. So songwriting is a little bit complicated. If you're doing it because people seek you out, I have no problem with you charging a day rate or charging a project fee. But if you're just going to songwriting camps, I probably wouldn't expect that. It's going to be mostly sitting in rooms trying to get songs placed. And if you do, you get paid. And if not, it's tough. Being a songwriter is tough. With that said, if I'm doing collaborations, I kind of just do them at my disposal. And for those, it's kind of just an equal split on Backend with the artist or with the other producers. For collaborations, I'm only doing them with like my friends or with artists that I am doing kind of spec work for and I really want to land. I'm not doing these a ton. And when I am doing them, money is not really a thought in my mind. I'm just doing them because I want to creatively do them. So with that said, those are all things that you should consider when you're setting rates or when you're getting ready to start charging for your work, whether you're a producer, mixing engineer, mastering engineer, songwriter, session musician. Keep all of those small factors in mind. Understand if you want to be paid work for hire or if you want to take the risk with Backend. If you are taking the risk with Backend, please be prepared to actually register all of that shit with all of those different agencies. Otherwise, you're never even going to see that money in the first place. And then other than that, always try to adjust your rates. If you're too booked up, raise your rates. If you're never booked, maybe try to lower your rates just a little bit because it could help a lot. But other than that, keep all of those things in mind. Hopefully this video has helped you set your rates. If it did, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. We really, really appreciate it. Other than that, head to our website, makepopmusic.com. We have sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs. We have a start to finish production course where we talk about this in even more detail. We give contract templates, we give project outline templates, all of that good stuff in that course. That's at makepopmusic.com. But other than that, we'll be back next week with much more content. I'll see you soon. Much love. Peace.